I am Kirti Tiwari presenting a talk on ecocriticism, which is a very interesting theory and quite relevant to the present times. Environmental degradation is one of the chief concerns of humans today. The intellectuals are also showing their commitment to create an environmental awareness in order to address the environmental issues. Ecocriticism is a critical theory that has emerged in this context as a recent trend in literature to analyze literary works from eco-critical perspective to bring about a positive change in society. This presentation is an introduction to ecocriticism, and it is hoped that it will be beneficial not only for the undergraduate and postgraduate students but also research scholars in developing critical insights. Those appearing for the competitive exams like NET and SET can also take advantage of this talk. I have divided my lecture into 3 parts. The first is an introduction, which deals with various definitions given by eminent scholars of the field, followed by a brief history of ecocriticism, and then the 4 waves of ecocriticism have been discussed. In the second part, the related concepts of ecocriticism are dealt with. The third part is practice in ecocriticism, discussing aims and concerns. To begin with, let us have a knowledge of the present situation. Long ago, Al Gore, former US Vice President, showed his concern in these words. I quote, "We are in unusual predicament as a global civilization. The maximum that is politically feasible, even the maximum that is politically imaginable right now, still falls short of the minimum that is scientifically and ecologically necessary." This draws the attention towards the seriousness of the situation. And something has been done, but vast is still left undone. So great efforts are required to put it right. Worcester, on the other hand, also presents the nature of this problem and suggests some solutions. He says, I quote, "We are facing a global crisis today, not because of how ecosystems function, but rather because of how our ethical systems function. Getting through the crisis requires understanding our impact on nature as precisely as possible, but even more, it requires understanding those ethical systems and using that understanding to reform them. Remember our ancient seers and sages who were gifted with great foresight. They have incorporated some beautiful practices as habits in day-to-day life of a common man. Unfortunately, we have either forgotten most of them or deliberately neglect them without realizing the importance of those practices. So this statement calls for going back to those practices to save the environment. So the next part of the definition tells us how efforts are needed from all quarters and what different intellectuals are doing. Historians, along with literary scholars, continues Worcester, anthropologists and philosophers cannot do the reforming, of course, but they can help with the understanding. So this tells us about the role of intellectuals as far as the environmental crisis is concerned. We are not policy makers, but we can create a consciousness that would be really beneficial and very effective. So we have seen that how the situation is serious. So what is the answer to this problem? As Booster says, cultural shift is required and eco-friendly practices will have to be reintroduced. And it is here that ecocritic's job becomes important, because he tries to analyze and evaluate environmentalism in culture. He studies culture. Say what are things are there from ecocritic point of view. So he analyzes the concepts like nature and tries to understand the cultural developments that have led to the present global crisis. Now, before we proceed, let us glance over the story or the history of ecocritic. Ecocritic is a word. Every word has its own story. Ecocritic is a word that is born or coined out of two words, oikos and critics, from Greek language. Together they mean house judge in English. Now, as Edward Hoagland says, oikos is nature, which is our widest home, and kritos is an arbiter of taste who wants the house kept in good order. So, an ecocritic is a person who wants to keep his house in proper order by judging and instructing, creating a consciousness and putting the picture right. So similarly, each individual should consider nature its home, and just as we try to keep our house neat and clean and in proper order, we should try to keep nature also. Now we have another statement of Marland. He describes ecocriticism as a range of critical approaches that explore the representation in literature and other cultural forms of the relationship between human and the non-human, largely from the perspective of anxieties around humanity's destructive impact of the biosphere. So here he includes human and non-human both, its representation in literature, and it studies the negative impact of humanity's behavior in our ecosystem. Jonathan Culler limits ecocriticism as follows. Most narrowly, it is the study of literary representations of nature and environment and changing values associated with them, especially evocations of nature that might inspire changes in attitude and behavior. Literary theory, a very short introduction. This is the work from which this statement has been taken. Now we take up Glotfelty's views on ecocriticism. He says ecocriticism is the study of the relationship between literature and physical environment, just as feminist criticism examines language and literature from a gender-conscious perspective, and Marxist criticism brings an awareness of modes of production and economic class to its reading of text. Ecocriticism takes an earth-centered approach to literary studies. So this is how he tries to explain by comparing it with feminist criticism and Marxist criticism. It is nothing but a proper approach towards a work of literature from a eco-critical point of view, earth-centered or nature-centered point of view. Now, after discussing eco-criticism, let us see how it began and grew. So it started in 1970s and gradually became a movement in 1990s. So in 1973 we have Raymond Williams' book The Country and the City. This is a seminal work for British eco-criticism because it links environmental concerns with class and politics. Then Anne Colotney's The Lady of the Land appeared in 1975 in USA. It's a feministic study of literary metaphor of landscape as female. Then in Britain, William Rooker used the term for the first time in his essay Literature in Ecology, an Experiment in Ecocriticism. That was in 1978. And then slowly it became a movement in 1990s. Then in 1992, 2 years later, an association for the study of literature and environment was formed. Now, looking at the global scene again, three eminent writers who laid the foundations of ecocriticism in America are Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and Henry David Thoreau. Their works lay emphasis on natural world. In Britain, Jonathan Bate was the first British critic to use the term in romantic ecology. He did a great study and he regards Wordsworth's thinking as ecocritical because he considers nature as an entity. He means Wordsworth considers nature as an entity and an area to be pondered about and not something to be controlled or used for one's benefits. Wordsworth, you remember, was a nature poet, and for him nature was friend, philosopher and guide. He never went to nature to utilize its resources. In fact, he went there to get consoled. Nature for him was a separate identity. In Wordsworth's Excursion, says again Bate, everything is linked to everything else, and most importantly, the human mind must be linked to the natural environment. The Lake District, we know that Lake District became very famous because of the lake poets. It became a cultural icon and tourist attraction. And now it is a national park. In this way, Bate wants to emphasize that poetry have made an intervention in ecosystem. Bate is of the view that environmental crisis necessitates cultural and critical realignments. This is how someone who is writing on nature or interpreting nature works can bring about a change. Then Bate again quotes the words of Wordsworth that he observed in reference to a poet. And this tells us how nature speaks to us and what we should do. He, that is the another poet Wordsworth is talking about, used to go out with a pencil and a tablet and note what struck him. Thus, an old tower, a dashing stream, a green slope, and make a picture out of it. But nature does not allow an inventory to be made of her charms. He should have left his pencil behind and gone forth in a meditative spirit, and on a later day he should have embodied in verse not all that he had noted, but what he best remembered of the scene. This reminds us of a very common trend that exists today, that people admiring natural beauty wants to visit places, and so they take package tours and go to places of scenic beauty to observe nature. And there also, instead of observing nature and getting involved in it, feeling it and imbibing its essence, they just keep on clicking pictures. So this is not the way to interpret nature. Nature does not allow you to make itinerary or inventory of its charms. So we should also be conscious after reading this that if we go to visit a site of natural beauty, we should first get absorbed in that scene and then try to reflect upon it. Now, after understanding in short about what ecocriticism is and its history, let us take an account of the 4 phases, again related to its growth only, of ecocriticism. So, in 1980, that means 10 years after its birth, there was the first phase, in which emphasis was on non-fiction representing non-human nature, that is wilderness. Then a decade later, in 1990s, diverse cultures and city landscapes were added. In 2000, all facets of human experiences from environmental point of view were explored. And after again a decade, the focus was on the fundamental materiality of environmental things, places, process, forces and experiences. Now, because of all these study and writing, a new term has emerged for ecocriticism. Later, criticism, it expanded its scope to history, philosophy and religion from environmental point of view. So apart from literature, other disciplines were also added, and this blended approach to humanistic thinking about the situation, says Scott Slovic, the meaning of a species in the world is now called the environmental humanities. So because it involves other history and other things, now it has become environmental humanities. Glotfelty states that for the subject matter, ecocriticism takes interconnectedness between nature and culture. This we have already discussed, that this is the job of an ecocritic. And as a critical instance, says Glotfelty, it has one foot in literature and the other on land. As a theoretical discourse, it negotiates between the human and the non-human. So, in this way, ecocriticism has flourished. Now, the demand of ecocriticism is to contextualize a study from ecological point of view, and it urges the writers to be more committed toward their society. They should write with a person. Forget about literature for literature's sake. Some commitment has to be there for the various issues of the society. And an issue like environmental degradation that has taken global dimensions need to be addressed by the writers. To study how people behave and are concerned with nature, ecocriticism now utilizes knowledge from scientists, writers, historians and critics. So obviously it has become multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So this is about ecocriticism as a theory, the introduction. In the second part, we will deal with different concepts of ecocriticism.